Well, it's now time. So, welcome back, everyone, to the last leg of the session. Our next speakers are Jake, Aziz, and Noah Elkins, who are going to tell us about Malagasy NR strengthening within and across prosodic boundaries. So, take it away.
Great, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all of you guys for having us. So as the title says, we are going to be talking about a process of strengthening that happens in Malagasy and looking at how it interacts with prosody. So first, a bit of background, which at this point you guys have heard a million times today. Malagasy is a Western Austronesian language spoken in Madagascar and Bayet by about 25 million speakers. And today we're going to be focusing on data that comes from a dialect called Marina, which is spoken in this region here on the island of Madagascar, outlined in red. The dialect situation is a little bit tricky in Madagascar, so we're not going to have time to go into detail about that, but we're looking at a specific phenomenon that is not generalizable across all speakers, but rather that occurs with only some speakers. And one further detail that's going to be relevant about Malagasy is the vowels. I say here 5 monophthongs, that's a typo, a, e, I, o, and u, and we're going to be talking about how those come into play with strengthening. So what is strengthening in Malagasy? Well, strengthening is a morphophonological process that's been observed in certain morphological constructions in Malagasy, whereby certain fricatives and liquids are strengthened to a stop or an affricate. So this has been observed and reported to be the case in both the genitive and compounds. So for example, if we wanted to make a genitive out of the word house, which is chanu, and suafali, which is horse, which would mean something like a house for horses, instead of saying chanun suafali, it's chanun suafali, where the S of suafali is strengthened to the affricate s. And the same can be said for ami and raini, which becomes aminjaini in the genitive, where that trill r is strengthened to a retroflex affricate j. This has also been observed in compounds. So for example, mitsu plus ranu, if you want to combine the words blow and water to create a word like bless, it's pronounced mitsu janu. Again, that R has been strengthened to a retroflex affricate j. So previously in the literature, as I've said, strengthening has been focused specifically, the interest in strengthening has been about compounds and the genitive. However, it's possible, or what we're going to talk about is whether or not strengthening can occur in the Malagasy phonology more generally beyond these specific morphophonological environments. So this sort of stems from a very brief comment in one of Matt Pearson's papers, where he mentions that the strengthening of R and R specifically is actually generally a property of word internal occurrences of adjacent N and R. However, this is pretty hard to test because Malagasy restricts codas as well as complex onsets, which means there's not very many instances of underlying NR except in the case of the genitive. So at this point, it seems like it would be hard to test whether or not strengthening is occurring word internally or just in the genitive with NR. However, luckily, there's been a recent phonological change in Malagasy where certain vowels undergo a process of deletion or devoicing. Specifically, what happens in Malagasy, specifically at least in Merida Malagasy, other dialects may differ, the unstressed high vowels U and E are very likely to delete in certain environments. And so what happens then is that you end up with an environment where there was previously a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant, and when that vowel is deleted, you end up with 2 adjacent consonants, which is not the case elsewhere in the phonology. So what this means is that we now have examples where an N and an R appear adjacently. And what we can say is that, just based on our own judgments about Malagasy, is that there is instances of strengthening that occur when you have an N followed by a deleted vowel and an R. So basically, when you have the N vowel R and that vowel is deleted, you now have this environment for strengthening. And what we want to do today is test whether or not this is actually an environment where strengthening occurs. So what this would look like under a rule-based account would be something like this. Let's take the monomorpheme mireni, which means wander. And first what would happen is that we would delete the unstressed high vowel. So mireni becomes mirenreni. Then it would undergo the strengthening process and you would end up with the output mirenjeni, if it were the case that strengthening occurred in this environment. So how did we lead this investigation? Well, what we wanted to do was test whether strengthening is in fact a feature of surface NR sequences generally, or if it's only specific to the genitive as had been described previously. Then we want to see if it is the case that strengthening can happen in all sorts of environments, what are those environments? Are they occurring within certain prosodic domains? Can they occur across prosodic domains, and so on? And we want to look at things like words versus phrases and so on. And then finally, we want to see if this strengthening process is non-categorical, are there any other factors that can impact strengthening, and how can we model this? So what we did for this current experiment, which is just at this point a preliminary look into this process, is we recorded 3 speakers of Merina Malagasy that read 27 different sentences, which included 30 instances where you end up with an N and an R that are separated by a vowel that we expected to be deleted. As I said before, not all Merina speakers do this. So we specifically looked at the ones that do this. There's probably we don't know exactly what factors at this point would determine whether or not a speaker strengthens, but that's not the specific focus of this project. So what we did then is we took instances of NR and we placed them in different prosodic environments. So for example, we can look at examples where we would expect an adjacent NR within a single morpheme. So as I said before, mireni is a monomorpheme. So you end up with an N and an R next to each other within the same morpheme. We also looked at examples where the N and the R are within the same prosodic word, but within different morphemes, specifically one being an affix and the other being a root. So for example, in this word, nire sajeseka, the ni is the past tense morpheme and the R belongs to the root. So what you end up with is the N and the R being in different morphemes within the same prosodic word. Similarly, we looked at compound words where the N and the R were in different roots within the compound. So for example, in this word, taniravu, you have the N belonging to the first root, which means earth, and the R belonging to the second root, which means happy. And that compound means chalk. Then we looked at examples where the N and the R were occurring within different words. However, they are in the same phonological phrase. So in this example, rununu, ratsi, rununu is one word and ratsi is another word, and they're adjacent within the same phonological phrase, but in different prosodic words. And then finally, we looked at examples where the N and the R were in different phonological phrases. And we're basing our definition of a phonological phrase on my own research, which has, in Malagasy, phonological phrase boundaries are very clearly marked with intonation. And so we would expect minu and rabe to be in different phonological phrases in this example, and therefore the N and the R would be in different phonological phrases as well. And so once we put the N and the R into all of these environments, we were able to look for instances of strengthening. So the first thing that we did is look for any instances where the vowel was deleted between the N and the R. We're not interested in examples where the vowel is voiced because this would not produce the environment for strengthening. And so we only focused on the utterances that included the deletion process. And then we went through and identified examples of strengthening. After that, we came up with a model that could predict the likelihood of strengthening occurring. So I'll just bear with me for a second as I do a little bit of phonetics to show you our methods. First, as I said, we identified instances of vowel deletion, both using auditory perceptual evidence. Basically, if there was a very obvious vowel, we would get rid of that token, and then looking for phonetic evidence as well, looking at the spectrogram and the waveform. So, oops, sorry. In this example, the vowel is pronounced, and you can see this because of 4 distinct regions in the spectrogram, which identify a vowel being there. And you can contrast this with this example, which is ni rununu, where the vowel has been deleted. And basically what you see is only 2 distinct examples on this waveform here, which are the N and the R, and there's no indication of a vowel being present here acoustically. And that's the boundary there. And then what we did is identified instances of our strengthening. And again, we looked for phonetic evidence. In particular, we looked for what we called the stop burst. And when you produce an affricate or a stop, the release creates what we call an acoustic burst. And this is quite evident on the spectrogram. In this example, here on the screen, there's no strengthening again, and there's nothing on the spectrogram that would indicate that there was strengthening. However, in this example here, what you see, you might be able to hear that it's affricated. Not only does it sound like tanjavu, but also you can see this burst on the spectrogram, which is this dark line that is indicative of a stop release. And that's the criteria we use to identify strengthening. So now I'm going to turn it over to Noah, who will discuss our results.
All right, thank you, Jake. So let's talk about our preliminary findings. So we find that strengthening of NR sequences occurs pretty often across our data set, even when the words are of course not part of the generative construction. So we're seeing that when vowels are deleting and giving rise to these now surface level NR sequences, the R is now in an environment where strengthening can occur. So this is what's shown on the table on the right. So within words, this is our first column on the left. So within words, which is the environment where we might expect strengthening to happen, given the previous Pearson analysis or the previous what was previously documented in Pearson 2005. This is happening non-categorically, but it's happening very often. So around 71% of the time, interspeaker, there's a high degree of strengthening occurring, so around 71% of the time. But as soon as you cross a word boundary, now rates of affrication are occurring around chance. It's around 45% of the time now affrication is occurring. When you cross a phrase boundary, affrication still happens, but to a lesser extent, only a little bit under 20% of the time. Strengthening, again, is not categorical. So all speakers are affricating to an extent and across different boundaries at different rates. And again, deletion of underlying E or U are both able to trigger affrication. So it doesn't matter necessarily what high vowel is being deleted, both are able to trigger affrication on the surface. So I wanted to turn next to how we wanted to model this data. So we aim to model the frequency of strengthening across speakers and identify what the prosodic factors are that are going to significantly affect strengthening rates. So as we find that these surface sequences of NR are being gradiently repaired by speakers and appear to be variably conditioned by these prosodic factors, what we wanted to do was turn to MaxN, maximum entropy harmonic grammar, to model speakers' productions. So I'm going to talk about what that is on the next slide. So MaxN is an optimality theory-based framework where probability distributions are calculated over candidates. So unlike in a classical OT strictly ranked framework, constraints in MaxN are weighted rather than ranked. So a candidate's probability of being outputted by the grammar is determined by its violation profile. And the probability of a candidate's being outputted by the grammar is inversely proportionate to the probability of its competitors. So what we can do after we establish a baseline model with standard markedness and faithfulness constraints is to test for the significance of any additional constraints. And this is conceptually and mathematically similar to finding a significant effect in a logistic regression model. So because MaxN is an OT-based framework, you need a couple of ingredients. So you need a constraint set con and also a candidate set gen. So I'm going to talk about the constraint set first. So first, because we find that strengthening of NR sequences occurs even when not part of the generative construction, we assume that Malagasy is going to penalize instances of surface sequences of NR by just some general markedness constraint, which we're just going to call star NR. So this is a brute force constraint, but you can conceptualize this as either some sort of optimal syllable contact constraint, assuming that the coda consonant needs to be more sonorous in the following onset, assuming that R as a liquid is more sonorous than N a nasal, or this is just a sort of relativized star CC constraint, given the fact that Malagasy phonotactics in general doesn't like to have most instances of two consonants next to each other. And so this is markedness constraint that's going to be in conflict with ident sonorant, which is a faithfulness constraint violated when the value of the feature sonorant of R changes when strengthened. So underlying R is sonorant, plus sonorant, and when it strengthens to J, the plus sonorant becomes minus sonorant. So these two constraints form our baseline markedness and faithfulness model. So additionally, as we were able to find that, at least impressionistically, boundary strength plays a role, we wanted to introduce increasing boundary strength into the model. So we did this by using increasing boundary strength by means of implementing these positional markedness constraints. So these were also of the type star NR, but particularly star NR across a particular morphological or prosodic boundary. So for example, number 1 says star NR across a morpheme boundary. So this constraint is violated if an NR sequence, particularly an unstrengthened NR sequence, straddles a morpheme boundary. The constraint in number 2 is similar, but this is star NR when the sequence straddles a compound boundary and so on and so forth. And when applicable, these constraints form a proper stringency hierarchy. So for example, the constraint in number 4, which is star NR across a phonological phrase boundary, will be violated if the unstrengthened NR straddles a phonological phrase boundary, but this also entails constraint violations of star NR across a prosodic word boundary and a star NR across a morpheme boundary, because this constraint is doing all of these simultaneously. So this is a way to incorporate increasing boundary strength into our model. Okay, so that was our constraint set. So because this is, again, an OC-based system, we also need to have our candidate set. So this is our gen. So what our gen was consisting of was these strengthened and unstrengthened candidates, which corresponded to the potential outputs of the test materials. So each word either was strengthened or not strengthened. And so each candidate's probability was calculated based on their violation profiles of all these constraints that were just mentioned. And so their probability distributions were calculated based on the probabilities of their competitors. Overall model fit was calculated based on the overall log likelihood of the entire model, and the best fit constraint weights were achieved using Microsoft Excel's solver function. So after we established the baseline model using ident and star NR, each of the positional markedness constraints that I talked about a second ago were added to the model one at a time to test for their significance, and each of their significances was tested using the likelihood ratio test. And so the addition of each constraint was considered significant if it significantly increased overall log likelihood, thus improving model fit. Okay, so here are our results. So of the 4 positional markedness constraints that were boundary sensitive, 3 of them actually had no significant effect on the model. So these were star NR across morpheme boundary, compound boundary, and word boundary. In fact, the only significant constraint, the only constraint that was found to be significantly improving model fit once we incorporated it into our accent grammar was star NR across a phonological phrase boundary. It had a modest but statistically significant p-value. So this is also evident with the increasing constraint weights as you increase boundary strength. So this is the table on the right. So the first 2 columns that show 0 weight are the ones that treat with strengthening that occurs within words. So within word strengthening freely occurs, and so the weights are essentially 0. When you cross a word boundary, the strength, the weight of the constraint increases a little bit, but it's not significantly. It doesn't significantly improve the model fit to incorporate that constraint. So these 3 constraints are not significant. However, the weight of star NR across a phrase boundary is given a very robust positive weight, and its addition to the model is significant. And so although we find that strengthening is gradiently sensitive to indeed any boundary, we have tokens where strengthening does occur across word boundaries and across phrase boundaries, there appears to be this inverse relationship between boundary strength and the likelihood of affrication of R. Okay, so let's put these results into, let's contextualize it in terms of the literature. So in a previous description of the Malagasy NR strengthening, Matt Pearson describes the process as being sensitive to word boundaries, indicating the strengthening is particularly a word internal process. But our findings suggest that actually word boundaries are not as sensitive to NR strengthening as phrase boundaries are. And interestingly, strengthening as a phrase internal process might actually serve as a non-intonational cue to prosodic phrasing in Malagasy. So as my colleague Jake has talked about in his previous research, phonological phrases in Malagasy are often clearly demarcated by pitch accents. There's a strong syntax prosody isomorphism, at least in terms of intonational phonology in the language. However, the lack of strengthening, at least of this segment, or faithfulness to underlying sonority, is this novel, strictly segmental diagnostic of prosodic phrasing in Malagasy that we were able to uncover. And lastly, I wanted to say that these preliminary findings might help situate Malagasy in this sort of growing typology. So a couple of recent papers have been able to find similar results in a number of different languages. So for example, in British English, a recent paper found that greater boundary reduced the likelihood of final obstruent deletion in British English. And another recent paper found that in Tokyo Japanese, larger boundary strength reduces rates of high vowel deletion. And so we're finding more cases that sort of help situate Malagasy with these other languages and language processes where increasing boundary strength helps scale the application of gradient processes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jake and Noah. The floor is open for questions. I see in front of me Lisa Travis and Carly Summerlot have, in that order, I think, raised their hands. So we'll go with, I don't know, Lisa first.
I didn't raise my hand. I didn't mean to raise my hand. Did I raise my, oh, I meant to clap my hands.
You know, the clapping and the hand raising are so visually similar. I apologize. Feel free to just butt in and talk, anyone who wants to ask a question. You can't trust my eyes, apparently. Okay, I don't see any raised hands. Okay, if there's no, I'm not seeing any raised hands.
Feel free to re-raise.
Yes, re-raise if. Actually,
I can't raise my hand. So.
Oh, okay. Ileana, do you have a question?
Well, sort of. I was just wondering about, the sort of variability that you talked about kind of early on in the talk. So for an individual speaker, was there variability in their strengthening?
Yes, so there was. There's two types of variability, one across speakers and one within speakers. So what we saw is that within all different prosodic environments, sometimes they strengthened and sometimes they didn't, meaning even within the word, which was the most common environment for strengthening, there were instances for all participants where they didn't strengthen. And then additionally, across the prosodic phrase boundary, which is the environment where it is least likely to occur, it did sometimes still result in strengthening. So I think that's the advantage of a sort of modeling like Maxent, which has the ability to implement weights that allow for variability. We acknowledge that Malagasy speakers will strengthen in all environments, but that it's more likely to occur in some environments than in other environments.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions, comments? While y'all are thinking, I have one question, which is, I don't think you addressed this. Are there any other constraints of the kind NR that you think might apply in Malagasy? Or that is to say, are there any other processes that you might be able to test in a similar way within Malagasy?
So we haven't observed any processes. This is the first segmental process that we've observed at the phrase boundary. We do want to eventually expand this to other instances of strengthening. So this is just NR strengthening, but what happens with S's? Do they strengthen in these same environments? What happens to H's? Do they strengthen in these environments, and so on? We just haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. But it would be interesting to see if this is an instance of strengthening more generally as it's been applied to things like the genitive, or whether it's specific to NR.
Okay, great. I see Lisa has her hand raised.
Yeah, so this one's real. Yeah, so I have kind of the same question, which is, so when I see that, I think of, compounding and the sorts of processes you see in compounding. So not only the strengthening, but kind of the assimilation of the nasal with the following, so, N becoming M, would you expect to see things like that, or thinking of looking at things like that?
Yeah, that's another good example. I'll write that down. But yeah, we haven't had the chance to look at something like that. But That one's interesting because, cross-linguistically, something like assimilation of nasals, it's so common. It would be interesting to see whether it's more driven by, phonetic, ease of production versus something that's more sensitive to prosody. So it's possible that it acts in the same way, but it's possible that that's something that happens purely for phonetic reasons.
Yeah, and I would think that you would expect, if you get the strengthening, you'd kind of have to have maybe the assimilation. I wouldn't expect to get it remain N, but an F becomes a P.
Right. Yes, I'd expect the same.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Let's have Connie Ting followed by Matt Pearson.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just have a quick question to build off of what Lisa had just asked. I'm just wondering if these sort of fortition effects happen when something other than N is preceding. I don't know if that was something that Lisa had just talked about. So you get the N and H, and that becomes the K. I think we talked about that earlier. And then also the place assimilation. But is there ever a context where you get the same place assimilation or fortition when it's not an N and it's something else?
So the only other instance I can think of is in compounds where there doesn't seem to be any sort of phonetic trigger for strengthening, right? Like, for example, in the example I had, I think it's Mitsuranu. There's nothing in Malagasy that says you can't have an U and an R next to each other, right? It happened if the two were in different, if it weren't a compound and you just had them side by side, I don't think we'd expect strengthening. So I don't know if this is, I don't know what's going on in the compound, whether there's something underlying there that's triggering this. Lisa, do you have an idea?
Yeah, I actually looked this up. It was one reason why my attention was taken away. And it's Mitsuka. Blow is
Mitsuka. The underlying form is Mitsuka.
Yeah, because I've never seen any, R become strengthened without some underlying, element that's
right. Right.
So
okay. Very interesting.
I have my dictionary here, and I looked it up. So it's Mitsuka.
Okay, so that's a good point then, Connie. We'll look at whether or not when the vowel is deleted in between, for example, a K and an R, whether or not strengthening happens. That's a really good point. Thank you.
Okay, Matt Pearson, we have at least a couple more minutes, or about a couple more minutes.
Okay, thanks for your talk. I think there might be two things going on here, and they could be different, at least phonologically. One is strengthening that is actually fusion of two adjacent segments into a single segment to repair, what would otherwise violate star CC, versus the situations that you're mainly focusing on, where two separate segments kind of come together as a result of deletion of a vowel in between them. And I think different things are happening in those different environments. So I'm kind of not surprised by your results here. That sort of throwaway comment that I made in the 2005 paper, the thing that I was thinking of was the an, when the an prefix gets added to a stem that begins with R, then you get the fusion. So man plus rusu becomes mandrusu. And in the compound case and in the genitive case, I think the analysis that I and some other folks favor is that ndra is actually a single segment, a single prenasalized segment. It's possible that when you have NR sequences created by deletion of an intervening vowel, that phonologically those things are still being treated as separate segments. And so maybe some of the difference in how speakers are behaving in terms of whether they strengthen or not could have to do with a difference in whether the strengthening is the result of fusion of two segments versus kind of trying to do a sort of surfacey repair of a CC sequence. I also have a story on why Mitsuka plus Ranu becomes Mitsudano. But I'm probably out of time, so we can talk about that later.
Yes, thank you for your comment. Also, I just want to make it clear, when we mentioned your comment in your paper, there was nothing wrong with that. We actually took that as a point of departure in the research. We weren't trying to challenge too harshly.
No offense taken. I'm really interested in these results. I'm glad somebody's working on this.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think that puts us just about at time. So let's thank our speakers, Jake and Noah. All right. Our next speaker